And if ever be in 2008, a Russian archaeologist working in a remote cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia picked up a tiny fragment of a finger bone so small it could fit on a fingertip, and had no idea he was holding proof that an entirely unknown branch of humanity had once walked the earth. When scientists finally sequenced the DNA hidden inside that fragment 2 years later, the result did not match modern humans, and it did not match Neanderthals either. It matched nothing anyone had ever seen before. This is the real story behind the headlines claiming ancient civilizations carried DNA that matches no known human. And while the specific claim of mapping every ancient civilization on Earth is an exaggeration, the underlying discovery is completely real, and it has quietly rewritten the entire timeline of human evolution, not once, but several times over the past 15 years. The Siberian finger bone belonged to a young girl who lived roughly 50,000 years ago in a cave that had been home to different groups of ancient humans at different points in time. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute in Germany extracted a tiny amount of genetic material from the bone and began comparing it against every known human and Neanderthal genome available at the time. What they found stunned the entire field of paleoanthropology. The girl's mitochondrial DNA was roughly twice as different from modern humans as Neanderthal DNA was, meaning this individual belonged to a population that had split off from the rest of the human family tree long before Neanderthals and modern humans even fully separated from each other. Scientists eventually sequenced her complete nuclear genome as well, confirming that she represented a previously undocumented group of ancient humans that came to be called Denisovans, named simply after the cave where the bone was found. What makes the Denisovan discovery so remarkable is not just that a new type of ancient human existed, but how completely invisible this group had remained despite clearly living across a huge stretch of Asia for tens of thousands of years. Unlike Neanderthals, who left behind hundreds of skeletons, tools, and cave sites across Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans left behind almost nothing physical, just that single finger bone, a handful of teeth, and eventually a jawbone identified decades after it was first found by a Buddhist monk on the Tibetan plateau. If it were not for the DNA itself, an entire branch of the human family, one that shaped the ancestry of millions of people alive today, would have remained completely unknown to science. Researchers comparing Denisovan genetic material against modern populations found something even more surprising, that people living in Papua New Guinea and other parts of Melanesia today carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes, meaning the so-called mystery population is not actually mysterious in the sense of having vanished without trace. It is quietly living on inside millions of people who have no idea their ancestors interbred with a separate branch of humanity tens of thousands of years ago. If Denisovans were the first major shock to come out of ancient DNA research, they were far from the last. And this is where the story connects directly to the kind of headline claiming that scientists mapped the DNA of ancient civilizations, only to find something that matches no known human. In 2025, researchers led by an archaeogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute successfully extracted and sequenced DNA from 2 naturally mummified women discovered in the Takarkori rock shelter in what is now southwestern Libya, remains dating back roughly 7,000 years to a period when the Sahara Desert was actually a lush green savanna filled with lakes and wildlife. When researchers compared the genetic material from these mummies against every major human population group, ancient and modern, the results did not match anything on record. These women belonged to a completely unknown lineage that had split off from sub-Saharan African populations tens of thousands of years earlier, and then remained almost entirely isolated for the rest of its existence, cut off genetically from the rest of humanity, even while living in one of the most fertile and hospitable environments on the continent. This newly identified group has been nicknamed a ghost population, a term geneticists use specifically for ancient human lineages that show up clearly in DNA evidence but leave behind almost no other trace in the archaeological or historical record. What makes the Takarkori discovery especially strange is the timeline involved. Genetic analysis suggests this population branched away from other African groups somewhere around 50,000 years ago, yet the mummified remains researchers actually tested only date back 7,000 years, leaving a gap of tens of thousands of years during which nobody knows where this population was living, how they survived, or why they remained so thoroughly isolated from every other human group around them. The lead researcher on the project admitted openly that even after successfully sequencing the DNA, the location of this population during those missing tens of thousands of years remains a complete mystery, since the Sahara's only turned green and hospitable relatively recently in the timeline, meaning wherever this group was hiding before that, it left absolutely no genetic footprint anywhere else that scientists have found so far. As if 2 entirely separate ghost populations were not enough, researchers working on the opposite side of the world uncovered something equally strange in 2025 while studying ancient remains from the Checua archaeological site north of Bogota, Colombia. Scientists sequencing DNA from hunter-gatherer skeletons found at high elevation in the Andes discovered genetic signatures belonging to yet another previously undocumented population, one with no meaningful genetic connection to any of the ancient North American groups that were assumed to be the ancestors of early South Americans. This population appears to have existed in the region for roughly 6,000 years before disappearing entirely, replaced by genetically distinct groups arriving from Central America. And just like the Libyan ghost population, these Colombian hunter-gatherers left no modern descendants that scientists have been able to identify anywhere in South America today. One archaeologist involved in analyzing the remains described the finding bluntly, stating that nobody in the field had previously believed any other unaccounted-for lineage could have existed in South America at all, making this discovery a genuine surprise even to specialists who study ancient migration patterns for a living. Perhaps the strangest example of unexplained ancient genetics does not come from a skeleton or a mummy at all, but from the genomes of people who are alive right now. Researchers analyzing modern DNA samples collected from populations in Nigeria and Sierra Leone discovered faint but unmistakable genetic signals that scientists refer to as ghost DNA, fragments of genetic code that clearly came from an ancient human ancestor, yet do not match any known human population, extinct or otherwise, anywhere in the existing genetic record. Unlike the Denisovan case, where an actual physical bone eventually confirmed the identity of the mystery lineage, there are no bones and no direct ancient DNA samples proving who this ghost ancestor actually was. The evidence exists purely as an echo, buried inside the genetic code of modern West Africans, strongly suggesting that ancient humans interbred with an entirely separate, now extinct group that science has never physically identified in the fossil record, and may never be able to, since no confirmed remains from this population found. Taken together, these discoveries paint a picture of human history that looks dramatically different from what scientists assumed just 20 years ago. The old model of human evolution imagined a fairly simple story: modern humans evolving in Africa, then spreading outward across the planet while occasionally encountering and briefly interbreeding with a small number of well-documented archaic groups like Neanderthals. The actual genetic evidence uncovered over the past 15 years suggests something far messier and more interesting: a human family tree with numerous hidden branches, entire populations that lived, interbred with our direct ancestors, and then either vanished or remained isolated for tens of thousands of years, all while leaving barely any physical trace beyond the genetic fingerprints preserved inside a handful of bones or hidden quietly within the DNA of their living descendants. Every one of these ghost populations represents a chapter of human history that was completely invisible until genetic sequencing technology became advanced enough to detect signals that no archaeologist digging through soil and stone could ever have found on their own. The technical process behind these discoveries is worth understanding because it explains why so many of these hidden populations remained undetected for so long. Ancient DNA is incredibly fragile, degrading steadily over thousands of years and becoming heavily contaminated by soil bacteria, fungal growth, and the DNA of every person who has ever handled the remains since their discovery. Extracting a usable, uncontaminated genetic sample from bones or mummified tissue thousands of years old requires specialized clean room laboratories, extremely sensitive sequencing equipment, and rigorous statistical filtering to separate authentic ancient genetic material from modern contamination. Even after a clean sample is obtained, researchers then need enormous databases of comparison genomes, both modern and ancient, to determine whether a sequence matches any known population or represents something entirely new. It was only in the past 15 to 20 years that all of these pieces, laboratory technique, computing power, and reference databases matured simultaneously to the point where discoveries like the Denisovans, the Takakori ghost population, and the Colombian mystery lineage became possible at all. There's also a deeper scientific reason why these unexplained populations keep turning up in completely unrelated parts of the world, from Siberian caves to Saharan rock shelters to Andean mountain sites. For most of human history, populations were far more geographically isolated than most people realize, separated from one another by deserts, mountain ranges, oceans, and simply enormous distances that made regular contact between distant groups nearly impossible for tens of thousands of years at a stretch. Small groups of humans could branch off, become isolated in a particular region, and then either die out completely, get absorbed into a larger population through later migration, or in rare cases, survive in genetic isolation long enough to become detectably distinct by the time modern genetic sequencing technology finally caught up with them. Each newly discovered ghost population is essentially a fossilized record of one of these ancient isolation events, a snapshot of a group that went its own separate way for thousands of years before either vanishing or quietly rejoining the broader human story. The Denisovan case, in particular, continues to grow stranger the more researchers dig into it. A separate discovery published years after the original fingerbone finding revealed something almost unbelievable: a bone fragment from Denisova Cave belonging to a teenage girl who turned out to be a direct hybrid, with a Denisovan mother on one side and a Neanderthal father on the other. Researchers affectionately nicknamed this individual Denny, and her genome represents the first confirmed case of a first-generation hybrid between two distinct archaic human groups ever discovered anywhere in the world. Finding a direct hybrid individual, rather than just genetic traces of ancient interbreeding scattered across modern populations, suggested that Denisovans and Neanderthals were not just occasionally crossing paths in Siberia, they were living close enough together and interacting. Closely enough that direct mixed offspring were not necessarily a rare event at all. This single discovery reshaped how researchers think about the relationship between different archaic human groups, shifting the picture away from brief, isolated encounters and toward something closer to overlapping, intermingled populations sharing the same landscape for extended stretches of time. The dating of Denisova Cave itself adds another layer of complexity to the story, since detailed radiocarbon and sediment analysis, conducted over a 5-year investigation, revealed that the cave was actually occupied by different groups at wildly different points in time, with Denisovans present during multiple separate periods spanning more than 65,000 years. Neanderthals moving in and out at various points as well, and modern humans only arriving as the very last occupants of the site. This means the cave itself functioned almost like a natural time capsule, preserving evidence of at least 3 distinct human groups passing through the exact same physical location across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, each leaving behind their own genetic and archaeological signature layered on top of the last. Understanding exactly when each group was present, and for how long, took years of painstaking work combining radiocarbon dating, sediment analysis, and genetic sequencing together, since the cave's deep, undisturbed sediment layers turned out to be notoriously difficult to date using any single method alone. The Takakori discovery in Libya carries its own additional layer of mystery beyond simply identifying an unknown lineage. Researchers studying the mummified remains found that these women showed clear signs of pastoral, herding-based lifestyles, consistent with rock art discovered nearby depicting cattle herding scenes from the same era, yet genetically they remained almost completely cut off from the sub-Saharan African populations, living not especially far away during the exact same period. This creates a genuine puzzle for researchers, since neighboring populations during the African humid period would presumably have had ample opportunity for contact and intermixing, given the fertile, hospitable conditions across the region at the time. Yet the genetic evidence shows remarkably little sign of it. Some researchers have proposed that geographic features within the Sahara itself, even during its lush, green phase, may have created natural barriers, mountain ranges or persistent stretches of less hospitable terrain that kept certain groups separated despite living on the same continent during the same favorable climate window. Others suggest cultural factors, patterns of marriage and social organization that discouraged mixing between distinct communities may have played just as large a role as geography in maintaining this isolation for tens of thousands of years. The Colombian discovery raises a different but equally puzzling set of questions, particularly around timing and disappearance. Unlike Denisovans, whose genetic legacy survives quietly in modern Melanesian populations, or the Takakori lineage, whose isolation at least makes some geographic sense, the Chekwa hunter-gatherers seem to have simply vanished from the region entirely, replaced within a few thousand years by genetically distinct populations arriving from Central America, with no evidence of significant mixing between the two groups. Researchers studying the site have openly stated that this kind of clean population replacement, with essentially no genetic trace of the earlier group persisting into later populations, raises difficult questions about what actually happened to them, whether through gradual decline, migration elsewhere, or some other cause entirely lost to history. Unlike a written record, DNA alone cannot explain why a population disappeared, only that it did, leaving researchers with a confirmed genetic mystery but no clear historical explanation to accompany it. What makes this field of research so exciting for scientists right now is the strong likelihood that more of these hidden populations are still waiting to be found. Researchers openly acknowledge that the 4 confirmed cases covered here, Denisovans, the Takakori lineage, the Colombian hunter-gatherers, and the ghost DNA detected in West Africans, are almost certainly not the only ones. Vast regions of the world, including much of Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the African continent, remain drastically understudied when it comes to ancient DNA sampling, partly because hot, humid climates degrade genetic material far faster than the cold, dry conditions that preserved Siberian and high altitude remains so well. As sequencing technology becomes cheaper and more Sensitive, and as researchers gain access to remains from regions previously considered too challenging for genetic analysis, most scientists in this field expect additional ghost populations to surface in the coming years, each one adding another hidden branch to a human family tree that keeps turning out to be far more complicated than anyone assumed even a decade ago. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you as much as it fascinates me, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because there is a lot more of this ancient genetic detective work still to uncover. It is worth being clear about what these discoveries do not mean, since viral headlines tend to stretch findings like these into something closer to science fiction. None of these mystery populations represent aliens, a separate species of intelligent life, or anything outside the normal, well-understood process of human evolution and migration. Denisovans, the Takarkori lineage, and the Columbian hunter-gatherers were all fully human or closely related archaic hominins, populations that branched off from the same evolutionary tree as everyone alive today, just isolated long enough to become genetically distinct before either dying out or blending back into the wider human story. The excitement here is not that something impossible happened, it is that something entirely natural. Isolated human populations branching off and quietly living their own separate histories for tens of thousands of years turned out to be far more common and far better hidden than anyone in the field of genetics expected even a single generation ago. It is also worth noting how quickly this field continues to move, since even the studies referenced throughout this video were only published within the past year or so, meaning the current scientific picture is almost certainly incomplete and likely to shift again as more samples get processed. Research teams around the world are actively expanding their sampling efforts into regions that were previously ignored due to poor DNA preservation conditions, including tropical rainforests in Southeast Asia and Central Africa, where high heat and humidity typically destroy genetic material within a few centuries rather than preserving it for millennia, the way cold, dry environments like Siberian caves do. New extraction techniques targeting particularly dense, well-protected bone structures, along with entirely new methods for detecting ghost DNA signals hidden within modern populations without needing any ancient physical sample at all, are steadily expanding the range of places and time periods where this kind of discovery becomes possible. Every single one of these technical advances increases the odds that another Denisovan-level surprise, an entire branch of humanity hiding in plain sight within a genome nobody had properly analyzed yet, is simply waiting for the right research team to look in the right place. The story of these hidden populations is ultimately a story about the limits of archaeology and the extraordinary power of genetics to fill in those gaps. Bones decay, wooden tools rot away, and entire settlements can vanish beneath shifting desert sands or dense jungle growth without leaving anything a shovel could ever find. DNA, when it survives at all, tells a different kind of story, one written in a molecular code that persisted quietly for tens of thousands of years, waiting for the right laboratory technique to finally translate it back into a coherent record of who lived, where they went, and who they eventually became. Every ghost population uncovered so far represents a piece of human history that would have remained permanently lost without this technology. And as genetic sequencing continues to improve, the next discovery, whether it comes from a Siberian cave, a Saharan rock shelter, or somewhere nobody has thought to look yet, is likely already sitting in a sample waiting to be analyzed, holding a secret about human history that nobody currently alive has any idea exists. There is a certain irony in the fact that some of the most groundbreaking discoveries in modern anthropology have come not from grand excavations or elaborate expeditions, but from small, unremarkable fragments, almost thrown away as insignificant. A finger bone mistaken at first for nothing special, a tooth nearly dismissed as belonging to a cave bear before a closer look revealed otherwise. Mummified remains sitting quietly in a rock shelter for 7,000 years before modern sequencing technology finally gave them a voice. Each of these unassuming objects turned out to hold the key to rewriting entire chapters of human history. Proof that the biggest scientific breakthroughs do not always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive as a fragment small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, waiting patiently for science to finally catch up and ask it the right question.